Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Wednesday, 13th September. It will be sunny in the morning and cloudy in the afternoon with highs of 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:23 a.m. and sunset at 7:12 p.m. We are on the 44th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and I hear that the Soviets are slowly advancing into Warsaw. Will they help?
Stop teasing our listeners, Philip. You know exactly what's going to happen with the Soviets. But we will. We're going to discuss this more in depth a little bit later on in the episode because they are advancing. There is a lot happening and it is important for us to be able to talk about it because for the past 44 days, they've pretty much done nothing to help the insurgents and the uprising, and we all know why. So anyway, what is happening on the ground with the insurgents? Well, there's a situation report number 55, which is published by Antoni Chruściel, who is the commander of the Warsaw Uprising. It states that in the northern part of the centre of the city, it was quiet during the day, except for the positions on Wronia Street, which were under attack by the enemy under the cover of several tanks. The attack was repelled. Otherwise, in the southern part of the city centre, there are attacks by Stukas, by the German Luftwaffe on the National Museum. The enemy are attacking from left, right and centre. They capture the French embassy and the Chinese embassy, and the Mutual Insurance building is heavily bombed. Otherwise, in Jolibush, in the northern part of the city, German infantry, which is supported, of course, by artillery and mortars, are attacking their position in the Maramont area. These attacks are repelled, which is great for the insurgents. Again, there is some sort of a plus. They're holding steady. And in Mokotów, there are several attacks by the German Luftwaffe, constant bombings. Most of the positions are held in Mokotów, except for the most extreme eastern part of Mokotów, where the insurgents had to withdraw about 100 metres south, and parts of the area are also being shelled by Soviet artillery. The one person I did want to also mention before I finish for today is Bernard Wojciech Menzel. He was the commander of the Megaphone Patrol, which was part of the Bureau of Information and Propaganda. We talked about this, gosh, right at the beginning when we talked about how the insurgents were dealing with propaganda issues, and Bernard was one of the people that was part of it, and I want to tell you a little bit about him. So he's not born in Warsaw in 1923, but he lived there from 1937. After the German occupation, obviously schools did not exist at that time, so he had to finish his high school diploma in secrecy in underground school, basically. When he'd finished, he went to the Underground University of Warsaw, where he did Polish studies and at the same time complete an officer cadet school. He was a poet, another poet. We're going to be talking about more people part of the intelligentsia. He was a poet and he worked for a Polish underground magazine called Art and Nation. This is the one way that Poles tried to continue and preserve their Polish culture. There was a large group of young artists and they were determined to keep it going. Unfortunately, all the editors died during the occupation because it was a great risk to be publishing such sort of materials that you weren't allowed to do so during the occupation. But he ended up being one of the editors. Of course, he dies during the Warsaw Uprising. While he worked at the magazine, he also worked as a night watchman at one of the coal yards where he helped hide Jewish children who were later transferred to more temporary, more permanent homes. And he also took part in sabotage actions as well during the occupation. But as I mentioned at the beginning, during the uprising, he was a commander of the Megaphone Patrol, and they would go around announcing news, propaganda, they'd sing songs, they'd try and keep up the morale of the people. It was a very important part of the propaganda section of the Home Army. And it's on this day that he dies, September the 13th. He is hit by a German sniper 3 times who was shooting from the tower of the Church of the Holy Saviour, which is a beautiful church on the corner down on Marszałkowska Street, down in the southern part. And a beautiful church. I really highly recommend people to be able to go in there. But the question here is, did his work survive? Well, his first text, which was a review of poetry, was submitted for printing of The Last Art and Nation, and it's only survived in the form of a text copy, which was intended for proofreading, and that's all we have. Well, that's what I say we only have, because it was believed for a very long time that any of his work was completely and utterly lost. It was thanks to a group of historians that managed to contact his niece, who managed to have saved his whole archive. So a book was published of his works and stands there today. So if anybody's interested, the book is called Selected Works by Wojciech Menzel. And I just want to finish on Derlewanga. We haven't really spoken much about Derlewanga. His men, which are supported by the Luftwaffe, assault guns, artillery and whatnot, they attack one of the churches on Tarnakowska Street, where 60 people are wounded and are also burnt alive inside this hospital. And once they get in there, after it's been bombed, after the fire has gone out, Derlewanga's brigade goes back in and murder more wounded and civilians inside it. Insurgents, which are under cover of machine gun fire, fall back. And now slowly we are moving further south with German soldiers followed by Derlewanga's men, who are cleaning everything up. But what else is happening? Because there's a lot going on. And Claire, with the advance of the Soviets, the Germans are doing a lot of crazy things, aren't they?
So we were talking yesterday about the massive importance of the River Vistula. Obviously, it's military strategic. It's also talking about it as a source of water when the water levels in Warsaw are so low that many of the wells that have been sunk by the population have now dried up. But now it becomes a sort of frontier point and a key battle area in the uprising. So it's today in the morning, large motorised columns of German troops are seen crossing the Poniatowski Bridge over the Vistula, heading from the east towards Wola in the west of the city. So basically, this is the Germans pulling their forces back on the Eastern Front, and ultimately they'll be moving back right towards Germany and towards Berlin. And so seeing this movement that afternoon, the Soviets bomb the bridge. They don't manage to take it out completely, but they do significant damage. And not long afterwards, just after midday, the Germans blow up the remains of the bridge, as well as taking out the main railway bridge across the river. And by the end of the evening, by just after 11 p.m. that night, the Germans have actually got everyone they want to across, and they have blown up 3 other bridges. So in effect, that's all the bridges across the Vistula cut. What the Germans are doing, of course, is they've got their people over, and they're now trying to slow the Soviet advance as they follow them west all the way back. So it's a very symbolic shift in the war. Now we have the Soviets really coming right into Warsaw and making their presence felt, and the Germans recognising that they have to move back and try to prevent the Soviets from following. And the Soviets, of course, they are now seeing this very positive for them forward progression in the war, and they start capturing areas. Roger, they take this, what do we translate it as? This Saxon mound? It's the Saxon clump. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the Soviets captured Saska Kempa, which is on the east side of the Vistula on this day, and they've not yet in total control of the east side. They have to wait until tomorrow for that, but they're certainly getting there, particularly aided by that German withdrawal that you just described, and they're welcomed in by those civilians in that district, who really view them as their liberators at that point, of course, because they've got rid of the Germans. They don't know what's to follow in terms of Soviet occupation and communization and all the rest of it. So they're very much welcomed as liberators at this point. And the Soviets also start to drop leaflets on the west side of the city, so on the west side of the Vistula, on the districts of Żoliborz and Czerniaków. They start dropping leaflets which essentially greeting the heroic soldiers of Warsaw and saying that we offer you brotherly help. And it says, today, September 13th, our plane will drop you this note, and at night military supplies and food will be dropped at your disposal. The airdrops will last all night. We'll see if the Soviets keep their promises.
In fact, they do make airdrops on this day. 282 Soviet planes take part. This is the first airdrop operation that they've done over Warsaw. And I mean, they're dropping significant numbers of supplies, 30 tons of food, 1,200 grenades, 80 firearms. And they're specifically targeting their containers to be dropped into the north of the city and the centre and along the River Vistula, all areas which are at least partially held by the Home Army. Although, in fact, a lot of these supplies, most of these supplies fell into German hands or were just destroyed, landing in burning buildings. But they did send containers down, packed with weapons, ammunition, also medicine and food. But even this was fairly cynical because a lot of their containers were dispatched either without parachutes or from such a low height that the chutes didn't have time to open. And there are reports of some being found with containers that were filled with weapons, but also with sandbags, which would obviously have made the containers far heavier. So when they land, they are smashing on the ground. And a lot of these supplies become absolutely useless. They're just broken. Zoe, the woman that I have been researching, she is on the ground. She's amazed. She finally sees these airdrops coming from Soviet aircraft. And yet she's absolutely furious because when she goes out to help collect these containers, she finds that she says everything was broken. And I have another account of a Polish soldier who said that the Russians looked on passively at the destruction. So nonetheless, this is the start of Soviet airdrops. From this day onwards, they made about just under 2,500 airdrops. And it's interesting to consider what their motives are. You know, they say we're calling out to you in that note that Roger read out with brotherly support, but they've been encamped on the far side, on the eastern side of Warsaw, just waiting for 6 weeks. So why now this brotherly love? What's made this turn? And there's a couple of things, of course. Essentially, the Soviets are doing it to appease the Western allies, but Stalin is encouraged to offer some support now because, well, first of all, he knows that the Polish resistance is virtually crushed, but he also wanted to prolong the uprising. He wants to keep them fighting, and for that they will need some supplies. He's kind of playing a bit cat and mouse with them. They've asked specifically for captured German supplies that they know how to operate, and what they're being sent, even if it doesn't smash, is Russian supplies, which the ammunition doesn't fit in the guns they've got. It's all a bit useless, but it's a show. It's more of a big show of supplies. It's theatre, really. But Stalin does want to give them some ability to keep fighting because it serves his ends. You know, if more Poles can take out more Germans, possibly some Polish resistance fighters, some potential leaders who might lead resistance against the Soviets in the future can be killed in this fighting. That all serves the Russian aims very well before they push west themselves. So any chinks in the German armour and the Polish resistance armour is good for the Soviets. The Soviets want the Home Army to do as much damage as possible to the Germans before the Soviets themselves really enter the city and will then be received, as Roger says, as liberators. I mean, they are liberators, but they're much delayed liberators who could have done this earlier. And now when they're giving aid, could be doing it much more effectively if they really wanted to arm the Poles enough to liberate themselves.
So do you get a feeling from your sort of key into this through Elżbieta Zabadzka and Zoe? Do you get a feeling from that it was the sentiment on the ground was that this was kind of cynically meant or not?
Certainly from her and her group of women, yes. I mean, they take the line at one point, among these containers there is some food and there's black bread. And Zoe actually says she refuses to eat the bread because she's so angry. I mean, she's absolutely furious. But of course, they all eat the bread because they're virtually starving. So, but that shows, their view on it. It's treacherous bread. It's from traitors. That's the feeling that they have. But of course, if you are civilians or even fighters, and you've been going for 6 weeks now, your water is running out. You don't have enough food. You're down to the yeast from the brewery now. They're making tiny, thin biscuits, cooking it outside, just like little wafers, like communion wafers, really. If that's what you've got, and then the Soviets come in and liberate you from the Germans, of course, there is going to be a huge sense of relief. And, they are genuine. And there's just a mixture of feelings, isn't there? Of course, some people are welcoming them as liberators. And in fact, they are liberators. They do go on. They liberate Ravensbrück. They are liberators. But it is well understood, I think, by the majority of the population that this liberation could have taken place 4 weeks earlier at the very least.
Yeah, I mentioned Eva, this messenger from the AL, the Armia Ludowa, the communist underground, who had crossed the Vistula eastwards to make contact with the Soviets the day before, on the 12th of September.
She's a communist Polish woman, isn't she?
Yes. So she's a member of the Polish Communist Underground, to clarify. The AL, the Armia Ludowa, the People's Army. And they are fighting in Warsaw, so alongside the Home Army, alongside the insurgents. As I said, she swam across the Vistula one of, I think, 4 messengers that went in that direction. And she crops up on the 13th of September. She crops up in Lublin, in further to the east in Poland, which of course was the headquarters of the sort of proto-government, the communist proto-government of Poland, which is called the Lublin Committee, which Stalin had set up, sort of ready for a government ready to sort of step in for when once the Home Army had been crushed and the Germans had been expelled. That was his government in waiting, as it were. So she crops up there and she gives a speech, which is widely reported in the communist press, which contained a few interesting points. And it sort of sets the scene to a large extent, I think, for the propaganda offensive which is to follow. And she makes a couple of points, one of which she says that the entire burden of the fighting in Warsaw fell on the AL, on the Armia Ludowa, on the communist underground. So not on the Home Army, the AK, but on the RL, which, as we know from listening to this podcast, is blatantly untrue. She also says that General Komorowski, head of the Home Army in Warsaw, and the government in exile in London, quote, have no authority among the fighting men and women and the population in Warsaw. Again, blatantly untrue. So this sort of downgrading, discounting of the Home Army and its connections to London, this sort of portrayal of them as usurpers, if you like. They're just people who've hoodwinked the innocent population and dragged them kicking and screaming into this horrible, costly conflict. So it's all the fault of the West. It's all the fault of the Home Army. So interestingly, one of the sort of favourite tropes, I suppose, or favourite tricks of, I suppose, all totalitarian propaganda, but you see it most notably coming from the Kremlin and from the communist side in this period, is what we call, I suppose, projection, which is where you accuse your enemy of precisely what you're doing or what you intend to do. And actually, funnily enough, you can see that now with Putin in Ukraine, because very often, he almost displays his own hand by accusing the Ukrainians of doing exactly what he would like to do or is planning to do. So it's something that you still see quite a lot. But there's a very good example of this in an article that this messenger Eva wrote the following day, which was published in Rzeczpospolita. And she says that the defence of the old town, she said, was primarily the work, i.e. in Warsaw, was primarily the work of the People's Army, i.e. the communist underground. And that the Home Army Command, the AK, so Komorowski and the insurgents that we've been talking about, she says that they deliberately kept silent about the participation of the communist underground. So it's kind of a complete inversion of the reality. So she's basically saying, first of all, she says that the Home Army has no authority, that nobody supports them, that this is just a sort of adventure sponsored by the capitalist politicians in the West. And then she says that these same people are keeping quiet about the crucial role that the communist underground has been playing, right? So it's kind of a complete inversion of reality. So it's an interesting microcosm of this sort of propaganda tactic of projection.
I just want to jump in here before you move on to your next point, because the audacity of this woman is just astounding. I've got 2 points to make here. Number 1, Armia Ludowa leave the old town way before anybody else does, at least 3 or 4 days, and they flee up to the north, right? So number 2, and Claire's already mentioned this in previous episodes, that Komorowski was one of the last people to leave the old town, and he was there fighting alongside his men. And she is bringing all of this around and just calling him all of these names, and it's very, very frustrating to see the propaganda that's being used against the insurgents, the Home Army, and to promote Armia Ludowa. There was 600 of them that were fighting compared to thousands of the Home Army. It's just ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous.
Well, this is just, when you don't have a dog in the fight, as it were, you look at, you say, audacity, but sort of mendacity to me. You see, all propaganda of totalitarian states is, the mendacity is often breathtaking. But it's sometimes hard to see past the sort of sheer breathtakingness of Soviet propaganda at this point, because they could tell you that the grass is blue and that the sky is green. It was quite astonishing how they would create this sort of fictional world. And I suppose she's a long way from the fighting. She's off in Lublin, so this is propaganda for the wider, particularly the communist world. This is for largely for internal consumption. So it's the deliberate creation of a narrative is what they're doing. It's quite astonishing. But yeah, as you say, it's brazen, absolutely brazen. And she says at the end of that speech, she says, everyone in the liberated areas, i.e. where she was in Lublin and elsewhere, is thinking of you, the defenders of Warsaw. Everyone only thinks about helping you. Help will be quick and effective, and this we pledge to you, remembering the blood shed in the capital. So again, it's sort of tying it in with those supply drops, which, as we said, were very possibly cynically meant anyway.
So moving away from the Soviets, it's been a very heavy Soviet episode. What is happening with the Germans? What are the Germans up to at this point?
Yeah, so we've covered Erich von den Bach a few times. His diary entries are always quite darkly amusing. His diary entry for the 13th of September, he says, first of all, he says Praga is lost. So the eastern side of the Vistula is lost, which is a rare dose of reality in his world. He also says that London radio has reported that I've been put on a list of war criminals. What an honour, he writes, just for Warsaw, where I can personally testify before God with the merit of the highest humanitarianism. Wow, that's an alternative universe right there.
Thanks so much for joining us for Day 44. Stay tuned for tomorrow's episode at Day 45. If you do like us, please make sure you like us on your favourite listening platform. And otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow.